You think you can feed my fiancé grandmother that slop? You disgusting, starving street rat.
Starving street rat. Bianca Moretti's voice shattered the silence of the De Luca estate like a gunshot. Elena Cruz, barely 24 and hollow-cheeked from giving up her own dinner for the third night in a row, was crouched on the cold marble floor. Her arms were wrapped tightly around Nana Rosa, who looked like a ghost in a worn purple dress. The 70-year-old woman was trembling so violently her cane rattled against the floor, her eyes wide with a primal fear that no woman of her age should ever know. Bianca, radiant in a blood-red designer dress that cost more than Elena would earn in a decade, lunged forward. Her sharp heel connected with the plastic bowl Elena had been holding, sending the thin, watery soup splashing across the pristine white marble. Get away from her, you pathetic cockroach. Bianca hissed, her face contorting into a mask of pure malice. She raised her hand, but Elena didn't flinch. She only pulled Nana Rosa closer to her chest.
Please, Miss Bianca.
Miss Bianca, Elena whispered, her voice cracking from her own exhaustion. She hasn't eaten in 2 days. She's so weak she can't even stand. You told the staff she was on a doctor-ordered fast, but she's starving. Look at her eyes. Hey fam, I want us to do something real quick. I want you to take a little of your time to like, comment and subscribe to the channel. Your engagement fuels the writer to write more. I love you fam because I know you would do so. Make sure to watch till the end and welcome to the new year of amazing stories. Bianca let out a sharp, mocking laugh that echoed off the high ceilings. She's old, Elena. She's senile. And you? You're a thief. I caught you stealing food from the pantry to feed your own mouth, and now you're using this dying woman as a shield. Bianca grabbed a heavy crystal decanter from the side table and slammed it onto the floor. The glass exploded into 1,000 glittering shards, one of them grazing Elena's cheek. Don't worry, Nana, Elena murmured, ignoring the sting of the cut. I've got you. I'm right here. What is the meaning of this? The voice was low, vibrating with a tectonic authority that froze the air in the room. Alessandro De Luca stood in the grand arched entrance, still clutching a bouquet of bright orange flowers he had bought for his grandmother. He looked every bit the Lion of Chicago, tall, broad-shouldered, and radiating a dangerous, quiet power in his open dark suit. Bianca's demeanor shifted in a heartbeat. The predator became the prey. She let out a choked sob and stumbled toward Alessandro, her hands trembling with practiced perfection. Alessandro. Oh, thank God you're back early, she wailed, burying her face in his chest. It was horrible. I caught her, this girl, this Elena, she was trying to force-feed your grandmother some spoiled scraps. When I tried to stop her, she pushed Nana to the floor. She's been stealing from us the whole time you were away. Elena looked up, her eyes burning with a mix of terror and hope. That's not true, sir. Please, look at your grandmother. She's starving. I only gave her my own bread because... Shut your mouth. Bianca screamed, pointing a trembling, manicured finger at Elena. You think Alessandro is going to believe a maid over his own fiancé? You're dangerous. She attacked me, Alessandro. She tried to hit me when I took the bowl away. Alessandro's jaw set into a hard, stony line. He didn't look at the flowers in his hand. He didn't look at the shattered glass. His steel-cold eyes were locked onto Elena, who was still kneeling on the floor, her arms protectively around the woman he loved most in the world. Step away from my grandmother, Alessandro commanded. The words weren't loud, but they carried the weight of a death sentence. Elena's heart felt like it had been dropped into a void. Sir, please, just touch her hand. Feel how thin she is. She's dying under this roof while you were gone. I said, step away. Alessandro's voice cracked like a whip, echoing through the foyer. Bianca let out a long, relieved breath, a small, triumphant smirk playing at the corners of her lips where Alessandro couldn't see it. Elena slowly, agonizingly, released her grip on Nana Rosa, shifting the frail woman against the bottom of the grand staircase. Elena's hands were shaking so hard she had to press them into the marble to stay steady. She looked up at the man she had once respected, seeing only a stranger blinded by a beautiful lie. The silence that followed Alessandro's command was heavier than the gold leaf molding on the mansion's ceiling. Elena rose to her feet slowly, her knees popping from the cold marble. She felt Nana Rosa's thin fingers snag for a moment on her apron, a silent, desperate plea for her not to go, but the shadow of Alessandro De Luca loomed too large to defy. Alessandro stepped forward, the heels of his Italian leather boots crunching over the shattered crystal decanter. He didn't look at Bianca as she clung to his arm, weaving her web of lies. His gaze remained fixed on the hollowed-out version of his grandmother. The Nana Rosa he had left 2 weeks ago was a vibrant, if aging, queen of the household. The woman slumped against the stairs now looked like a candle that had burned down to a pile of gray wax. "Look at her, Alessandro," Bianca whispered, her voice a fragile flute of false concern. "She's been so confused while you were gone. She refused everything I offered. I brought her the finest chefs, the best soups, and she just threw them. And then this creature tried to force her to eat something she found in the trash. It's a miracle Nana is even breathing." Elena felt the heat of indignation rise in her throat, a fire that briefly burned away her fear. "I didn't find it in the trash, sir. It was my dinner. It was all she had to eat for 3 days because the kitchen was locked on Miss Bianca's orders." Bianca gasped, a hand flying to her throat as if she had been slapped. "How dare you? Alessandro, are you hearing this? She's trying to blame me for her own negligence. I've been exhausted trying to manage this house and your mother's health while you were securing the Chicago territory. I haven't slept, I've been by her side every hour." Alessandro finally looked at Bianca. His face was an unreadable mask of Sicilian stone. He reached out, and for a second, Elena thought he was going to comfort his fiancée. Instead, he gently but firmly uncoupled her hands from his sleeve. He walked to the bottom of the stairs and knelt beside his grandmother. Nana Rosa's eyes flickered. She tried to speak, her cracked lips moving, but only a dry, rattling sound emerged. She looked at Alessandro, then her eyes darted fearfully toward Bianca. She didn't reach for her grandson. Instead, her hand moved toward the spot where Elena had just been standing. "She's disoriented," Bianca insisted, stepping closer, her red dress swishing like a warning. "She doesn't know what she's doing. She needs her medication. Elena, get out. Go to your room and pack your things. You're lucky we don't call the police for elder abuse." "Wait," Alessandro said. He reached down and picked up the piece of bread that had fallen from the bowl when Bianca kicked it. It was dry, cheap, and half soaked in the watery broth now staining the floor. He turned it over in his large, calloused hand. Elena held her breath. This was it. Surely he would see that a thief wouldn't steal such a miserable scrap. Surely he would see the hunger in his grandmother's trembling frame. But Alessandro's exhaustion was a heavy veil. He had spent 14 days in smoke-filled rooms dealing with men who wanted him dead. He looked at the bread, then at the glamorous, weeping woman he had chosen to be his wife, and finally at the ragged, dirt-streaked maid who looked like she belonged in a soup line. "Is this what you were giving her?" Alessandro asked, his voice dangerously low. "It was all I had, sir," Elena pleaded. Alessandro stood up, his height blocking out the light from the foyer chandelier. He tossed the bread into the mess of glass. Bianca is right. My grandmother is a DeLuca. She doesn't eat scraps from a maid's plate. If you were truly caring for her, she wouldn't be on the floor. He turned to his head of security, who was standing by the door. Pay her for the month and get her off the property. I want her gone before the sun sets. The world seemed to tilt. Elena looked at Nana Rosa, whose eyes filled with tears as she watched her only protector be discarded like trash. Bianca stood behind Alessandro, and for a fleeting, sickening second, the mask slipped. She looked directly at Elena and smiled, a slow, predatory baring of teeth that promised this was only the beginning of the nightmare for the woman left behind in the house. The cold rain of a Chicago autumn began to lash against the towering windows of the DeLuca estate, mimicking the sudden, icy shift in the room's atmosphere. Alessandro stood like a pillar of granite, his shadow stretching long and dark over the broken glass and the shivering woman on the floor. He didn't look back at Elena. His focus was entirely on the chaos Bianca had artfully curated. Bianca moved with the grace of a seasoned performer, kneeling beside Nana Rosa with a silk handkerchief. It's okay now, Nana. The bad girl is going away, she cooed, her voice dripping with a sweetness that made Elena's stomach turn. She looked up at Alessandro, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. I tried so hard to protect her, Alessandro. But Elena, she told the other servants that since you were away, she was the one in charge of the West Wing. She's been redirecting the grocery deliveries to her own family in the city. That's why there's nothing in the pantry. That's why your poor grandmother has been reduced to this. Elena felt the air leave her lungs. The lie was so monstrous, so perfectly constructed to trigger Alessandro's protective instincts, that she couldn't find the words to fight it. She was just a maid, the daughter of a man who had died in service to the DeLuca family, while Bianca was the daughter of an empire. I have never stolen a single crumb from this house, Elena finally managed to whisper, her voice trembling but clear. Check the cameras, sir. Please. Just check the kitchen feeds. Bianca let out a sharp, jagged sob. The cameras? Oh, Alessandro, tell her. Tell her how she disabled the West Wing circuit 3 nights ago. I found the wires cut myself. I was too afraid to tell you over the phone while you were dealing with the commission. Alessandro's head snapped toward Bianca, his jaw tightening so hard a muscle pulsed in his cheek. The security of his home was his obsession. If the cameras were down, it wasn't just a matter of a hungry grandmother, it was a breach of his kingdom. He turned his gaze to Elena, and for the first time, she saw true, unfiltered hatred in his steel-gray eyes. You took advantage of my absence to compromise this house? Alessandro's voice was a low, dangerous growl. You left an old woman to rot so you could fill your pockets and leave my gates blind? I didn't. She's lying. Elena cried out, reaching a hand toward him in a desperate gesture of supplication. But Alessandro had already turned his back. Vincenzo, he barked, not even looking at his head of security. Strip her of her uniform. Give her 5 minutes to clear her locker. If she is still on my property after that, throw her into the street. Vincenzo, a man who had known Elena's father, looked at her with a fleeting glimmer of pity, but he knew better than to argue with the lion. He stepped forward, his hand heavy on Elena's shoulder. Come on, kid. Don't make this harder. As Elena was led away, she looked back one last time. Nana Rosa had managed to grab Alessandro's hand, her frail fingers digging into his skin. She was trying to shake her head, her mouth working silently to form the word no, but Alessandro was too busy listening to Bianca whisper about calling a private doctor to undo the damage the maid had caused. In the servants' quarters, the air was thick with the scent of bleach and suppressed whispers. The other staff members turned their heads away as Elena threw her meager belongings, a few worn books, a spare shawl, and her most prized possession, a silver locket, into a small canvas bag. She felt the weight of their silence. They knew. They had seen Bianca's cruelty, but they also knew that in the DeLuca house, the truth was a luxury only the powerful could afford. 10 minutes later, the heavy oak side door groaned open. The wind howled, spraying a mist of freezing rain into the hallway. Vincenzo stood by the door, his face a mask of regret. "I'm sorry, Elena," he muttered, pressing a small envelope of cash into her hand, her final wages. "He's in a rage. There's no talking to him when he's like this." "He's killing her, Vincenzo," Elena said, her voice dead and hollow. "By the time he realizes what Bianca is, there won't be anything left of Nana to save." She stepped out into the storm, the door slamming shut behind her with a finality that echoed through her very bones. As she trudged down the long, winding driveway, the lights of the mansion blurred behind her. She had nothing but the clothes on her back and a heart heavy with the image of a starving old woman reaching for a ghost. High above in the master suite, Alessandro stood at the window, watching the small, lonely figure disappear into the darkness. He felt a strange, nagging pull in his chest, a flicker of doubt he couldn't quite extinguish. But then he felt Bianca's warm hand on his shoulder. "She's gone, darling," Bianca whispered. "Now we can finally be a family again." The storm outside the DeLuca mansion intensified, the wind rattling the heavy window panes as if trying to force its way into the cold, silent house. Inside, Alessandro moved through the dimly lit kitchen, his footsteps echoing like a funeral march. The house felt wrong. Usually, the air here smelled of garlic, slow-simmered marinara, and the warmth of a home that had stood for generations. Tonight, it smelled only of lemon polish and a sterile, hollow emptiness. He opened the massive, walk-in pantry, expecting to see the usual bounty, wheels of Parmesan, hanging cured meats, and jars of preserved vegetables from the family's estate. Instead, his eyes met bare shelves. A single, dusty box of pasta sat in the corner, and a few withered onions lay forgotten on the floor. His brow furrowed. Bianca had said Elena had been stealing the inventory to feed her family, but the emptiness felt systematic, as if the life had been bled out of the room over weeks, not days. He found a small container of broth in the back of the refrigerator and warmed it, the steam rising in the quiet kitchen. He poured it into a fine china bowl, the gold rim glinting under the lights, and made his way up the grand staircase. He wanted to fix this. He wanted to prove to himself that he was the provider, the protector, and that the order of the DeLuca house had been restored now that the poison had been cast out into the rain. When he entered Nana Rosa's bedroom, the air was thick and stagnant. The fire in the hearth had died down to a few glowing embers, providing little warmth. Nana Rosa was propped up against a mountain of lace pillows, looking smaller and more fragile than the shadows dancing on the walls. "Nana," Alessandro said softly, his voice losing its iron edge. "I brought you something to eat. Real food. Not that trash from earlier." He sat on the edge of the bed, the mattress shifting under his weight. He blew on a spoonful of the warm liquid and held it out to her. But as the silver spoon approached her lips, Nana Rosa didn't open her mouth. Her eyes, clouded with age and trauma, fixed on the spoon as if it were a weapon. She let out a small, whimpering sound and pressed her back into the headboard, her thin shoulders hunching. Her hands, little more than skin and bone, came up to cover her face. She began to tremble, a violent, rhythmic shaking that made the bed frame creak. "Nana, it's me." "It's Alessandro," he insisted, a knot of unease tightening in his chest. "I'm not going to hurt you. I'm here to take care of you." He reached out to touch her arm, but the moment his fingers brushed the sleeve of her nightgown, she flinched so hard she nearly fell from the bed. She let out a choked, panicked cry, a sound of pure terror that Alessandro had only ever heard from men facing the end of a barrel. She wasn't looking at him with love, she was looking at him with the same primal dread she had shown when Bianca was looming over her. "Why are you doing this?" he whispered, the bowl of broth cooling in his hand. "The girl is gone. You're safe now." Nana Rosa's eyes darted toward the closed door, then back to Alessandro. She pointed a shaking finger at the bowl, then at the door, her head shaking frantically. She tucked her hands under her armpits, making herself as small as possible, refusing to take even a sip. The silence that followed was suffocating. Alessandro looked at his grandmother, the woman who had raised him with a fierce, unbreakable spirit, and saw a broken bird waiting for the next blow. He set the bowl down on the nightstand, untouched. As he stood to leave, his foot caught on something hard beneath the edge of the bed. He reached down and pulled out a small, locked wooden box that Nana used for her most private mementos. It was scratched, as if someone had tried to pry it open. He looked back at his grandmother, but she had turned her face to the wall, her breathing shallow and ragged. Doubt, cold and sharp as a needle, began to prick at the back of his mind. If Elena was the one starving her, why was Rosa flinching from the man who had supposedly saved her? And why, in a house of infinite wealth, was the pantry as empty as a tomb? Alessandro walked out into the hallway, his heart heavy with a growing, silent suspicion that the lion had been invited into a trap of his own making. The hallway was a tunnel of velvet shadows and freezing drafts. Alessandro walked toward his study, his mind a chaotic storm of Nana Rosa's terrified eyes and the hollow silence of the house. As he reached the top of the grand staircase, the toe of his boot struck something metallic. It skittered across the marble with a high, melodic ring that felt out of place in the heavy atmosphere of the estate. He knelt, his large fingers sweeping the floor until they closed around a small, cold object. It was a silver locket, tarnished and dented, hanging from a snapped chain. He held it up to the dim light of a wall sconce. It was cheap jewelry, the kind a maid would save months to buy, but as he turned it over, he noticed a familiar crest etched into the back, 2 crossed sabers over a shield. His breath hitched. That wasn't the De Luca crest. It was the mark of the Gardas, a lineage of men who had served as the personal shadows to his father for 30 years. With a flick of his thumbnail, he pried the locket open. Inside was a tiny, faded photograph of a man in a formal security uniform, standing tall with a stoic, loyal expression. Beside him stood a younger, softer version of Elena, her eyes bright with pride as she clung to the man's arm. Alessandro's blood turned to ice. He knew that man. That was Mateo Cruz, the head guard who had taken a bullet meant for Alessandro's father during the 2012 uprising. Mateo had died a hero's death, and the De Luca family had promised to look after his bloodline forever. Elena Cruz, Alessandro whispered, the name tasting like ash in his mouth. He had known there was a daughter, but in the whirlwind of taking over the syndicate and expanding his empire, he had lost track of the faces in the servants' quarters. He had assumed she was just another hire, a faceless girl in a blue and white uniform. Instead, he had just thrown the daughter of the man who saved his father out into a freezing rainstorm like a common thief. A Garda's child was raised with a code of honor that was more rigid than the law. The idea of Elena stealing bread or cutting security wires felt suddenly, jarringly impossible. It would be like a priest desecrating his own altar. "Alessandro? Why are you standing in the dark?" Bianca's voice drifted from the doorway of the master suite. She was draped in a silk robe, a glass of dark red wine in her hand. She looked soft, beautiful, and utterly composed. "I found this," Alessandro said, standing up and holding the locket out. "It belonged to Elena." Bianca glanced at the silver trinket and let out a light, dismissive laugh. A piece of junk. She probably stole it from a pawn shop. Honestly, darling, you're obsessing over a girl who is already blocks away in the mud. Come to bed. The house is quiet now. We can finally relax. Alessandro looked at Bianca, then back at the photograph of Matteo Cruz. He remembered Matteo's final words on the cold asphalt years ago, "Take care of my girl." She didn't steal it, Bianca, Alessandro said, his voice coming out as a low, dangerous rumble. This is her father. Matteo Cruz. He died for my family. Bianca's smile faltered for the briefest of seconds, a flicker of something, fear? Calculation, crossing her eyes before she smoothed it over with a shrug. Well, how tragic. It just goes to show that loyalty isn't hereditary. Even the best trees can grow rotten fruit. She reached out to take the locket from him, but Alessandro closed his fist, the sharp edges of the silver biting into his palm. I'm going to the security room, he said, stepping past her. Now? Alessandro, it's nearly midnight. The system is glitched anyway, you heard me say. I didn't ask for your permission, Bianca, he interrupted, his tone as sharp as a razor. He didn't look back to see the expression on her face, but he felt the heat of her gaze following him down the hall. For the first time in their engagement, the lion wasn't following the path his fiancée had laid out for him. He was following a trail of silver and blood. The air in the security basement was thick with the hum of cooling fans and the scent of ozone. Alessandro sat before a wall of monitors, his face illuminated by the cold, blue light of the screens. He had spent his life navigating the shadows of the underworld, but the darkness he was looking for now was buried within his own home. Access the secondary server, Alessandro commanded, his voice a low vibration in the small room. The one Bianca said was cut. Vincenzo stood behind him, his arms crossed over his chest, his face etched with a grim anticipation. He tapped a series of commands into the console. The primary feed for the West Wing is indeed dark, boss. Just like she said. The wires were physically severed near the junction box. Alessandro's jaw tightened. And the auxiliary backup? The one hidden in the smart home hub? The screen flickered, then stabilized. Because Alessandro was paranoid by nature, every appliance in the house was an ear, every smart fridge and thermostat was a hidden eye. He navigated to the kitchen's smart hub logs. He didn't look at the video first, he looked at the data. The smart fridge logs were a digital diary of cruelty. For the last 14 days, the lock on the main refrigerator had been engaged 24 hours a day. The digital access code used to lock it? Bianca's birthday. Alessandro felt a surge of nausea. The logs showed the fridge had only been opened twice a day, once in the morning and once at night, for less than 30 seconds each time. Long enough for Bianca to grab a bottle of wine or a pre-made salad, but never long enough for a full meal to be prepared for the household. Pull up the hidden wide-angle feed from the pantry sensor, Alessandro ordered. The video began to play. It was grainy and black and white, but the truth was unmistakable. He saw Elena Cruz enter the kitchen in the middle of the night. She looked gaunt, her uniform hanging off her frame. She approached the locked refrigerator, pulled at the handle, and slumped against it when it didn't budge. Then, he saw her open her own locker in the corner of the servants' dining area. She pulled out a small, crumpled paper bag. Inside was a single, hard roll of bread and a small apple, her own meager staff meal. Alessandro watched as Elena carefully sliced the bread in half. She ate a tiny fragment herself, then placed the rest back into the bag. The footage jumped forward 2 hours. Elena was back, this time creeping toward the stairs with the bag tucked under her arm. She was taking her own food to Nana Rosa. She wasn't stealing, Vincenzo whispered, his voice thick with realization. She was the only one keeping your grandmother alive. Go back to 3 days ago, Alessandro said, his tone so flat it was terrifying. The day the camera supposedly went dark. The screen shifted. The footage showed the hallway leading to the West Wing. Bianca appeared, dressed in a silk nightgown, a pair of heavy garden shears in her hand. She didn't look frightened or meddled with. She looked focused. With a single, brutal snip, she severed the primary camera cables, then turned to the remaining lens and smiled. It wasn't a smile of joy, but of complete, calculated victory. Alessandro watched the screen, his fist clenching the silver locket so hard the metal began to warp. He saw the starvation for what it truly was, a slow, agonizing execution disguised as neglect. Bianca hadn't just been lying, she had been trying to kill the woman who was the heart of the De Luca family, all while Elena Cruz, the daughter of a man who had died for him, had sacrificed her own health to stand in the gap. The final clip showed the scene from earlier that afternoon. He saw Bianca kick the bowl. He saw her spit on the floor. And he saw Elena's face, not the face of a thief, but the face of a martyr. Alessandro stood up, the chair screeching against the floor like a wounded animal. He turned to Vincenzo, his gray eyes now burning with a cold, predatory fire. Find out where Elena went, Alessandro said. And Vincenzo? Yes, boss? Prepare the dining room for a feast tomorrow night. I want the Castellanos and the Morettas here. And tell the chef to prepare nothing for my fiancé. Not a single crumb. The digital timestamp on the monitor rolled back 6 days, flickering with the static of a memory Alessandro had been too blind to see. The screen showed the servants' kitchen at 4 in the morning, a time when the rest of the mansion was draped in a deceptive peace. Elena appeared in the frame, her movements sluggish, like a ghost haunting the halls of her own life. She moved toward the small, wooden table where the staff took their breaks. In her hand was a single, small bowl of plain white rice, her entire daily ration provided by the head housekeeper under Bianca's strict budgetary cuts. Alessandro watched as she stared at the food, her hand trembling so much the spoon rattled against the ceramic. Her face was gaunt, the skin stretched tight over her cheekbones, and her eyes were sunken from a week of sleeplessness and deprivation. Just as she was about to take a bite, a faint thud echoed from the ceiling, the sound of Nana Rosa's cane striking the floor in the room above. Elena froze. She looked at the rice, then at the ceiling. A visible war played out on her face, the primal, gnawing scream of her own stomach against the ingrained loyalty of a Garda's daughter. With a soft, pained exhale, she covered the bowl with a cloth and stood up. She didn't eat a single grain. Instead, she began the long climb up the back stairs to the West Wing. The footage transitioned to the hallway outside Rosa's room. Elena was leaning against the wall, her eyes fluttering as she fought a wave of dizziness. She reached for the doorknob, but her knees suddenly buckled. She collapsed, her shoulder hitting the doorframe with a sickening thud before she slid to the floor in a heap. The bowl of rice shattered beside her, scattering white grains across the dark wood like fallen snow. My God, Vincenzo breathed, his voice cracking the silence of the security room. She was starving herself to death just to keep the old woman going. On the screen, Elena remained motionless for nearly a minute. Then, her fingers began to twitch. Slowly, agonizingly, she dragged herself into a sitting position. She didn't cry. She didn't scream for help. Instead, she began to pick up the spilled rice, grain by grain, placing the clean ones back into a fragment of the bowl. She forced herself to stand, using the wall for support, and entered Rosa's room with a shaky, determined smile plastered on her face. Alessandro watched as Elena sat by his grandmother's bed. He couldn't hear the words, but he saw the way Elena stroked Rosa's hand, the way she carefully fed her the salvaged rice, laughing as if it were a game, pretending she wasn't currently feeling her own organs fail from lack of nourishment. The footage jumped forward to the following night. The pantry was bare, the fridge locked tight. Elena was in the laundry room, drinking tap water from her cupped hands to fill the void in her belly. She looked at the silver locket she wore, the image of her father, and whispered something to it. She looked like a flickering candle in a hurricane, yet she refused to go out. The last part of the playback showed Elena in the servants' locker room just hours before Alessandro's return. She was trying to button her uniform, but her fingers were too weak to manage the small plastic discs. She had to sit down twice just to put on her shoes. When the bell rang for the evening tea, a tea Bianca had ordered only for herself, Elena stood up, adjusted her apron, and walked toward the lion's den with her head held high, carrying the secret of her suffering like a holy relic. Alessandro stared at the frozen image of Elena's gaunt face on the monitor. The locket in his hand felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. He had called her a thief. He had called her a parasite. But the screen didn't lie. She was the only person in his empire who had practiced the loyalty he so loudly demanded from everyone else. She had given her very flesh to protect the woman who had given him life. Vincenzo, Alessandro said, his voice a low, vibrating chord of fury and grief. I don't just want her found. I want a medical team on standby. If a single hair on her head has been harmed by the cold tonight, the Moretti family will learn exactly how the lion handles those who starve his pride. The morning sun filtered through the rain-washed windows of the De Luca estate, but the light brought no warmth to the halls. Alessandro stood in the center of the grand foyer, his face a masterpiece of controlled indifference. He had not slept. Instead, he had scrubbed the blood of his father's guard's daughter from his conscience, replacing it with the cold, calculating focus of a man preparing for war. When Bianca descended the stairs, draped in ivory silk and smelling of jasmine, she found Alessandro leaning against the mahogany banister. He looked relaxed, the tension that had defined his return the previous day seemingly evaporated. Alessandro, darling, she sang, her eyes searching his face for any lingering suspicion. You look so much better. I hope you put that unpleasantness with the maid behind you. I've already contacted a new agency, they'll have 3 candidates here by noon. Alessandro straightened his suit jacket, a faint, ghost-like smile playing on his lips. Actually, Bianca, you were right. I was far too stressed. In fact, I realize I've been neglectful of the alliance between our families. I want to celebrate our upcoming union tonight. Bianca's eyes lit up with a greedy shimmer. A celebration? Oh, Alessandro, that's wonderful. I've already had Vincenzo send word to your father and brothers, Alessandro continued, his voice as smooth as aged whiskey. A grand feast. I want the Moretti family here, under my roof, to witness exactly how much I value the loyalty you've shown while I was away. Especially the way you handled my grandmother. Bianca's heart skipped a beat, but her pride blinded her to the steel beneath his words. It's about time you recognized my hard work. Managing this estate, and Rosa, is an exhausting task. I can only imagine, Alessandro replied, his gaze flickering toward the kitchen where the staff was moving with a frantic, silent urgency under Vincenzo's watchful eye. I've given the chef very specific instructions. Tonight will be a dinner no one in Chicago will ever forget. Throughout the day, the mansion transformed. Florists arrived with towers of lilies, and the long mahogany dining table was laid with the finest De Luca silver. Alessandro played the part of the doting fiancé to perfection, even accompanying Bianca to the garden as she picked out the wine for the evening. He listened to her chatter about wedding venues and jewelry, all while the silver locket sat heavy and cold in his pocket, a constant reminder of the girl he had cast into the storm. By 7 o'clock, the Moretti family had arrived. Bianca's father, a man who wore his greed like a badge of honor, clapped Alessandro on the shoulder, laughing about the unfortunate situation with the help. They gathered in the drawing room, sipping expensive bourbon, while Bianca preened in the center of the room, playing the part of the future queen of the De Luca Empire. Alessandro watched her from the shadows of the arched doorway. He saw her laugh as she described how she had saved Nonna Rosa from the maid's incompetence. He saw the way her brothers joked about the filth they had to clear out of their own estates. Every laugh was a nail in the coffin of their alliance. "Dinner is served," Vincenzo announced, his face an impenetrable mask. As they moved toward the dining room, Alessandro paused, leaning down to whisper in Bianca's ear. "You look stunning tonight, Bianca. Truly. Red was always your color. It reminds me of the soup on the marble yesterday." Bianca stiffened for a fraction of a second, her smile faltering, but Alessandro was already leading her father toward the head of the table. The room was bathed in the warm glow of 100 candles, the scent of roasting meat and rich herbs filling the air. It looked like a scene of ultimate luxury, a homecoming fit for a king. But as they took their seats, the atmosphere shifted. The Moretti men had plates piled high with delicacies, truffle risotto, braised short ribs, and roasted vegetables. But when the servers reached Bianca, they paused. Alessandro sat at the head of the table, his hands folded neatly in front of him. He didn't look at the food. He looked directly at Bianca, whose plate remained white, cold, and utterly empty. "Alessandro?" she laughed nervously, looking around. "The servers seem to have missed me." "Oh, they didn't miss you, Bianca," Alessandro said, his voice dropping into a register that made the wine in the glasses tremble. "We're just having a very special menu tonight. A menu inspired by your own culinary choices over the last 2 weeks." The laughter at the table died instantly. The homecoming was over. The judgment was beginning. The chandelier above the dining table hummed with a low, electric tension that seemed to vibrate through the fine crystal glassware. Bianca's father, Silvio Moretti, cleared his throat, his fork hovering over a succulent piece of braised rib. "Alessandro, this is a bit unconventional, isn't it? A joke, perhaps? My daughter's plate is as bare as a bone." Alessandro didn't look at Silvio. He didn't even pick up his wine. He remained perfectly still, his silhouette cast in sharp relief against the dark velvet curtains. "It's no joke, Silvio. It's an exercise in empathy. You see, Bianca has been very vocal about the sacrifices she made while I was away. I thought it only fair that she experience the same culinary regime she curated for my grandmother." Bianca's face drained of color, the vibrant red of her dress now making her skin look like polished marble. "Alessandro, you're being dramatic," she whispered, her voice trembling despite her attempt at a light laugh. "If this is about that maid again, I told you, she was the one." "The cameras are back online, Bianca," Alessandro interrupted, his voice a silk-wrapped blade. "The secondary servers. The ones you thought you'd silenced. I watched you snip the wires. I watched you lock the pantry. And most importantly, I watched you kick a bowl of soup out of the hands of a woman who hasn't had a full meal in 14 days. A suffocating silence fell over the room. Silvio's fork clattered onto his plate. Bianca's brothers exchanged nervous, dark glances, their hands moving instinctively toward the jackets where they concealed their weapons. But Vincenzo and 4 other De Luca guards moved into the light of the doorway, their expressions as cold as the winter outside. "You sat at this table yesterday and told me you were exhausted from caring for her," Alessandro continued, leaning forward until he was inches from Bianca's face. She could smell the scent of his expensive cologne and the metallic tang of his simmering rage. While you were drinking my vintage Barolo and ordering silk gowns, the daughter of a man who died for this family was feeding my grandmother crumbs from her own meager plate. Elena Cruz fainted from hunger while you were picking out floral arrangements. Bianca tried to stand, her chair screeching against the floor, but Alessandro's hand shot out, his fingers locking around her wrist like a steel manacle. Sit down, he commanded. She collapsed back into the chair, tears of genuine terror finally spilling over her cheeks. It was for us, Alessandro. She's old, she's a burden. I wanted us to start our lives without that weight dragging us down. Silvio stood up, his face reddening. De Luca, you can't treat a Moretti like this. We have a treaty. The treaty died when your daughter tried to murder my blood, Alessandro roared, his voice finally breaking its tether, echoing through the room like a physical blow. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the warped silver locket, slamming it onto the table in front of Bianca. This belongs to a woman who understands loyalty better than your entire bloodline ever will. He signaled to the servers. They stepped forward, but instead of food, they placed a single, dry, crusty piece of bread on Bianca's empty plate. It was the same piece Alessandro had found in the glass earlier, cold, soggy, and pathetic. Eat, Alessandro said, his eyes fixed on hers. Eat it all, Bianca. Because it's the last thing you will ever receive from the De Luca estate. By the time the sun rises, the Moretti name will be erased from our books. Your father's warehouses, your brother's docks, everything is being seized as a penalty for your breach of hospitality. Bianca looked at the bread, then at the predatory faces of the De Luca guards, and finally at the man she thought she had tamed. She saw no mercy in him. The lion hadn't just returned, he had come to purge his den. Vincenzo, Alessandro said, standing up and smoothing his jacket. Take the Morettas to the gate. And find out if the medical team has reached Elena's apartment yet. I'm done with the appetizers. It's time to bring my family home. The dining room had become a tomb of high-end silk and shattered illusions. Alessandro stood at the head of the table, his presence filling the room like a gathering storm. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and pulled out a small remote, clicking it with a rhythmic, mechanical precision. The far wall, draped in heavy velvet, slid open to reveal a massive projection screen. Alessandro, please, Bianca whimpered, her hands clutching the edges of her empty plate. Whatever you think you saw, it's not what it looks like. I was under so much stress. I was doing it for our future. Watch, Alessandro commanded. His voice was a flat, terrifying line of sound. The screen flickered to life, the high-definition footage filling the room with the harsh reality of the last 14 days. The guests, Bianca's father and brothers, sat frozen as they watched the woman they thought was a pampered socialite transform into a monster. They saw her mocking Nana Rosa's thirst. They saw her dumping a bowl of soup onto the floor and laughing as Elena Cruz tried to salvage it. But the final blow was the audio. The hidden microphones in the West Wing captured Bianca's voice, sharp and clear. Just die already, you old hag. You're holding up my throne. And as for that little maid? I'll make sure she's begging on the streets by the time Alessandro gets back. Silvio Moretti looked away from the screen, his face ashen. He knew the laws of the underworld, he knew that the breach of hospitality and the attempted murder of a Don's matriarch was a debt that could only be paid in blood or total ruin. Alessandro clicked the screen off. The room plunged back into the warm, mocking glow of the candlelight. You stripped my grandmother of her dignity, he said, walking slowly toward Bianca. You stripped Elena of her livelihood and her safety. Now, it is time for the world to see you for exactly what you are. He looked at Vincenzo. Take her rings. The De Luca family diamonds do not belong on the hands of a murderer. Vincenzo stepped forward. Bianca tried to pull her hand away, but the guard's grip was like iron. He twisted the 5-carat emerald-cut diamond from her finger, the metal scraping against her skin. Next came the pearl necklace, then the designer watch. Within seconds, the Queen of Chicago was stripped of every symbol of the status she had so desperately craved. You are no longer a fiancé, Alessandro stated, leaning down until his eyes were level with hers. You are no longer a Moretti of any standing. I have already contacted the journals. By morning, every social circle from here to New York will know of your unstable nature and your expulsion. No one will take your calls. No one will open their doors. You are a ghost, Bianca. You can't do this. Silvio shouted, though his voice lacked conviction. She's my daughter. She is a liability, Alessandro countered, turning his freezing gaze to the older man. And if you wish to remain in business, you will disown her tonight. Otherwise, the Moretti assets will be liquidated to pay for Nana Rosa's medical bills and Elena Cruz's compensation. Do I make myself clear? Silvio looked at his daughter, her face streaked with mascara, her expensive dress now looking like a shroud, and he looked back at the lion. He slowly sat back down and picked up his wine glass with a shaking hand. He said nothing. Vincenzo, throw her out, Alessandro ordered. Not through the front doors. Use the servants' entrance. The one she forced Elena through. No coat. No purse. Let her see how long her pedigree keeps her warm in the rain. Bianca screamed as 2 guards hoisted her up by her arms. She kicked and clawed, her heels dragging across the marble, but the De Luca men were unmoved. Her cries faded as she was dragged down the service corridor, the heavy iron door at the end of the hall slamming shut with a finality that shook the house. Alessandro turned back to the table. He picked up the piece of dry bread Bianca had left behind and dropped it into a silver trash bin. Dinner is over, he said to the remaining Morettis. Get out of my house. I have a debt of honor to pay, and I don't want your shadows in my way. The storm had finally broken, leaving the streets of Chicago slick and reflecting the neon hum of the city. Alessandro's black SUV tore through the narrow alleys of the district where the city's working poor lived in the shadow of skyscrapers. He clutched the silver locket so tightly the metal edges drew a thin line of blood across his palm, but he didn't feel the sting. All he felt was the suffocating weight of a debt he could never fully repay. They found her in a cramped, drafty rooming house 3 blocks from the bus station. Elena was sitting on the edge of a sagging cot, still wearing her damp, stained maid's uniform. She was shivering, her head resting against the peeling wallpaper, her eyes closed in a state of exhaustion that looked dangerously close to sleep. When the heavy oak door creaked open, she didn't jump. She didn't have the strength left for fear. She only opened her eyes, blinking at the tall, imposing figure of the man who had cast her out. Are you here to take the locket back, too? She whispered, her voice a ghost of a sound. It's all I have left of him. Alessandro felt a crack in the granite of his heart. He didn't speak. Instead, he dropped to one knee on the cold, linoleum floor, a position a De Luca had not taken for anyone in a generation. He reached out and gently took her small, frozen hands in his. I am here to ask for the impossible, Alessandro said, his voice thick with a raw, uncharacteristic emotion. I am here to ask for your forgiveness. Elena looked down at him, her brow furrowing in confusion. Sir? I was blind, he said, pressing the silver locket back into her hand and closing her fingers over it. I looked at you and saw a servant, when I should have seen a hero. I should have seen the daughter of Mateo Cruz, the most loyal man I ever knew. You saved my grandmother's life while I was protecting a throne that wasn't worth the dirt on your shoes." Elena's eyes filled with tears, not of anger, but of the sheer relief of being seen. She was so hungry, Alessandro. I couldn't leave her. I promised your father, long ago, that I would watch over the family. And you did, Alessandro replied, his gaze unwavering. You did what I failed to do. He stood up and reached out his hand to her. The Morettas are gone. Bianca will never set foot in my world again. But my grandmother is calling for you. She won't eat, she won't sleep, and she won't let the doctors touch her. She only says one name. Elena looked at his hand, then up at his face. She saw the lion, but for the first time, she saw the man behind the mask, a man humbled by the quiet strength of someone he had thought was beneath him. She placed her hand in his. The return to the estate was silent, but the atmosphere had transformed. As they entered the grand foyer, the staff stood in a line, their heads bowed, not in fear of Alessandro, but in respect for the girl returning in a ruined uniform. Alessandro led her directly to the west wing. When the door to Nana Rosa's room opened, the old woman's face transformed. The terror that had clouded her eyes for weeks vanished, replaced by a radiant, tearful joy. She reached out her thin arms, and Elena ran to her, the two women clinging to each other in a bond forged in the darkest of trenches. Alessandro stood in the doorway, watching the scene. He turned to Vincenzo, who was standing in the shadows of the hallway. "Update the household records," Alessandro commanded softly. "Elena Cruz is no longer staff. From this moment on, she is a ward of the De Luca family. She is the protector of this house, and her word is law in these halls. She is to have the East Suite, and she is to be given everything she was denied while I was blind." Vincenzo nodded, a small smile touching his lips. "And her title, boss?" Alessandro looked back at Elena, who was finally feeding Nana Rosa a spoonful of soup, the two of them whispering and laughing softly. He thought of his father, and he thought of Mateo Cruz, and he finally understood that true power wasn't found in a crown, but in the loyalty of those who stand by you when the world goes dark. "Tell the city she is a daughter of the De Lucas," Alessandro said. "And tell them the lion has finally learned how to protect his own." The story of the starving grandmother and the poor maid became a legend in the city, a reminder that in the house of the lion, the smallest heart often carries the greatest strength. If this story touched your heart, please press like and share it with those you love so they too can hear this meaningful tale. Do not forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you do not miss the emotional stories we bring you every day. We sincerely thank you for staying with us until the very last moment. Wishing you and your loved ones abundant health, joyful lives, and hearts always full of love. Goodbye.